So he has to remind me every time. All right. Okay. So we finished up James and are now in Hebrews. If you're watching online, I just want to say I just shared a little bit about St. Valentine, but we'll do that hopefully if I can remember in second service. So hopefully we'll get to hear that together. But so we finished up James. We're in Hebrews. Hebrews is a fascinating book. We ended last week by talking about, could there be different influences of other religions on some of the Christian thoughts that's taking shape and forming here? And the answer is yes. Is there Eastern influence? Is there Platonic influence? And the answer is, yeah, I think there's a lot of influences that are happening. If you just take Plato, for instance, which I think you're going to see some fingerprints of Plato's thought. Plato, who's writing in the 4th century BCE, and then his students kind of take it and progress that thought. You see a kind of Neoplatonism, I think, that shows up quite a bit in Hebrews, but not just there, it shows up in other places. And I don't think this is a bad thing. I've often heard, ideas that we really need to preserve sort of Christian thought and theology so it's not influenced by outside influences. And the truth is, there's at no point can you reach any core of faith that's not like influenced by its neighbors. It's there. You see it throughout the Hebrew scriptures. You see it in the New Testament. If you, for instance, when in Exodus, when you see a context in which there are many, many gods, in the Torah, Yahweh says to the people, not that I'm the only God, but that just, amidst these other gods, just don't have any before me, right? It's influenced by its peers around it. Later on, there is a monotheism that begins to take shape, but that's centuries down the road, right? Christianity, by the time Jesus is walking the earth, there is already a tremendous influence that is of Platonism that's in the Greco-Roman world. And so there's a lot of influences here. And I'll just say, like, as a preacher, one of the things that is really important to me is to be able to try to translate like study and a message into sort of like concepts and things that are normal to us or popular conception to us, and that may be on more peripheral things, but I think it happens on central things. So if you have, say, the Jewish philosopher Philo, well, he was quite the scholar, Plato scholar, but he is, he's taking tools and thoughts and concepts, and rather than saying these are enemies, is actually seeing what gifts does this sort of thought have, what truth can I see in this, and what is harmonizing with the truth of my faith that I can kind of marry some of these things. I think it's actually quite beautiful. And I think it's something that is worth doing. Whether it's with Buddhist thought or Muslim thought or humanist thought or Hindu thought, like I think that there's beauty in truth in lots of different faith practices and philosophies, and just seeing where there is resonance and maybe using that framework to kind of shed light in a new way on your own faith, I think can be quite helpful. So, is it bad to say, oh, I see some Platonic thought in Hebrew? I don't think so. I'm more interested if you think it's helpful in shedding some light on some of these things. So, y'all ready to jump in? All right. So here's a trivia question to start off with. Who wrote the letter to the Hebrews? Yes. We don't know, right? How many times do we say that in the New? We just don't know. There's been lots of speculation and theories. There's some that say that Paul wrote it. Many will say, well, the Greek is very different in Hebrews than in some of his other letters, like Philemon and so forth. Some will say, well, maybe it was Apollos. Some will say maybe it was there's female authorship. In all of this is possible, plausible? Who knows? We just don't know. Some have said maybe Hebrews is more of a sermon. It's just if you think of it as a long sermon. And there's some interesting scholarship that looks at the form of it, and maybe it reads more like a homily than a letter, or a homily that was turned into a letter. All of this is very possible, but we don't exactly know who wrote it. We don't know who exactly the audience is. We don't know where they are or where the author is. So it's a little challenging to get some of those contextual details. But it does seem that the author is quite familiar with the audience. And it seems that the audience is experiencing, well, I'll put it like this. The author has some very specific concerns about the audience. And so maybe you see if there's anything that comes to the surface as to what you think might be a concern that the author has for the audience. All right, but it comes right out of the gate with some words that are some words are very sticky. They stick in my mind, and the opening of Hebrews is such a sticky opening that it just I think it's so good. It's part of why I do think of Hebrews as a sermon more than maybe I think about it than other things, because that is a great crafter of words right there at the beginning. But would someone just start reading chapter 1, verses 1 through 4?
God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets. But in these last days he has spoken to us by a Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the world.
Can we just stop there? Sorry, I got to stop. Like, my goodness, that's amazing rhetoric right there. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets. And so, like, these are people that you highly regard: Isaiah, Elijah, Elisha. These are Ezekiel. These are people that you hold in high regard. These are people who kept close companionship with God, and God used as a mouthpiece to speak to the people and do these miraculous words. So that tradition of saying that long ago God spoke to God's people in many and various ways through the prophets, but now, so it's taking people who occupy a pretty high space in your kind of theological imagination, in your tradition, and it's saying, and there's one even greater. That's a theme that you're going to see throughout Hebrews. There is this that we know from our stories in the Hebrew scriptures and our traditions that is pretty central and incredible, but Christ is even greater. So that's constantly happening. It is not to diminish the prophets. It's not saying that Isaiah was a two-bit pipsqueak of a prophet. No, it's just to say that Christ is even more, right? So that God is now speaking in these last days through his Son. So more than a prophet. Okay. And then goes on to say something of the Son that God is that God is using to speak through. The author is saying that this Son is appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the worlds. So this is sounding like Colossians. It's sounding like the beginning of John, right? These are things you would not say of Isaiah or Ezekiel, so on and so forth. Okay. There's a musical rendition to these first couple of verses. If you're interested, I'll play it for you. I think it's amazing. All right. Okay. You mind to keep going, Charles? Verse 3.
He is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being, and he sustains all things by his powerful word. When he had made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs.
Okay. All right. Safe to say the author's a fan of Jesus, right? I think it's safe to say has what we might call a very high Christology, right? Notice the language here. Verse 3, he is the reflection of God's glory in the exact imprint of God's very being. So the Christ is if you want to know who God is, the character, the nature, the shape, the heart of God, look at Christ. This is the exact imprint of who God is. It is the reflection of God's glory. And then goes on to say, to use this purification language, right? Where do we see like that kind of language? I don't know if you can remember, if you can reach like way back in your brains when we were studying Torah. But there was this documentary hypothesis of like trying to like dissect the Torah to being, more attributed to this source. People who had, say, a more Deuteronomic kind of framework, those who had a more priestly framework. Well, this is a very kind of priestly kind of framework. It's talking about purification, right? Where sacrifices were discussed in the Torah as like a way of purifying the community or an individual. Like we even talked about like the way blood factors in, the blood of sacrifices. It's gross. It doesn't resonate with our culture and religious practice, but at the time certainly reflects wide practices, religious practices, but was seen as somehow like this spiritual cleanser that helped cleanse people of their impurities, of their sin. And so that kind of language of sacrifice that you would find in these priestly sources in Torah is being used to talk about Jesus here. That Jesus is the one who purifies sin. So, and then after the sin is purified through Jesus, and again, we don't have mention of a cross here, but that language makes you think of a sacrifice and blood, right? But then it talks about the exaltation of Christ, not just anywhere, but at the right hand of majesty on high, having become superior to the angels as the name that is inherited more excellent than theirs. So again, you've got Jesus talked about as being the one that God is spoken through. Jesus is the one that is not just a prophet, like God spoke through prophets, but is greater. Jesus is the agent of creation, the very reflection of God's glory and the imprint of God's nature. He's the one that has purified sins, and he is the one that's been exalted to sit at the right hand of God in majesty above the angels. So he's not just superior to prophets, but superior to angels. So, I mean, I don't know what you could pack into that word count that would make Jesus sound much more impressive than that, right? I mean, that is some high Christology there. That is somebody that is talking about Jesus in very soaring language. But it's also important to point out that the way in which some of the key sort of themes and echoes that we see right off the bat is pulling from Hebrew Bible, right? Hebrew tradition, the Torah. The idea that the prophets are mentioned, the purification, that priestly language. There is angels. There's a, you might say there is a kind of like shared narrative of the past, which has led some people to say, and commentators to say, that the audience here may be Hebrew Christians, Jewish Christians. That because it seems like there's a lot of assumed knowledge of the Torah and of the prophets and of the tradition. So maybe that's why it's called the letter to the Hebrews. So just maybe be picking up on that because there's going to be a lot of allusions and a lot of references to these characters and stories in the Hebrew Scriptures. So, okay. Charles, do you mind to keep going in verse 5?
Winds and his servant flames hated lawlessness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you, and to the oil of gladness beyond your companions. And in the beginning, Lord, you found the earth, and in the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like clothing, like a cloak. You will roll them up, and like clothing they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will never end. And to which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? Are not all angels spirits in the divine service, sent to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation?
Okay. All right. So I think if you were to boil all that down, you might have and put it in the form of an equation. Like, with my kids, we always have to do like greater than, less than signs, knowing we always say like, the bigger side, the alligator eats the bigger number. That's how I taught them. But I think if you were to put this in an equation, it'd be like Jesus greater than angels, right? I think that's the simple equation there, right? God says things of Jesus that he would never say of angels. And by the way, what does angel mean? Angelos, I mean, just it's messenger, right? And even like angels as concepts, as like entities that are thought theologically as God's messengers. I mean, that's something that's not there in the beginning, in the earliest traditions of Judaism, but something that develops over time as well. But certainly here, they're factoring quite prominently, because when the author here in the first chapter has the most extended sort of the most extended way of trying to describe Jesus's significance, it's to say, imagine these angels. Jesus is way better, right? Yes, angels are messengers of God. They are like these spiritual creatures that we hold with great reverence and, are quite lofty in our imagination. But Jesus sits at the right hand of God. This is a messenger on a whole nother status level, right? This is somebody not just sent by God. This is somebody who is the exact imprint of God, who is now the mouthpiece of God. So. That's a great question, Charles. I do not. Well, exactly. I mean, you'll find estimates, but I mean, like, let's say sometime in the second half of this first century AD. That's the safest thing to say about the whole New Testament. But when in there, don't know.
Well, Jesus is now dead, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And the people, this was intended for, some of them not believe Jesus was superior to the angels, or what?
Oh, did some people believe? Well, I think that this is trying to understand who Jesus was. Theologically, yes, was something that was, that was a central question, obviously, in the earliest years of the church. And, who is this Jesus? And I think as we've mentioned that you definitely see this Christology sort of like building with this, like Jesus is God kind of, or Jesus, to put it in the language of Hebrews, is this imprint of God's being. So I do think that you're going to get a spectrum of people who will answer that question differently in that first century. Who is Jesus in relationship to God? This would be on the, if you're like Jesus is like, you think his status is here, and Jesus, you think his status is here. If that's the spectrum, like Hebrews is kind of over here for sure. And maybe preaching in such a way or writing in such a way because he feels like he needs to get some folks in his audience, their Christology up, that they need to enlarge their imagination of Christ. Maybe that's the point of the emphasis here. Who knows? One of the reasons that some people think the author might be Apollos is because we have reference to Apollos as a great preacher. Even Paul, says, I may not be a great preacher, but Apollos had one as being a magnificent, moving speaker. And so some folks think maybe this is an Apollos sermon or something that inspired by it. Who knows? But at the very least, we see that the author has this very, very high view of Jesus and wants the audience to as well. But remember, I said keep an eye out for the concerns that the author has or the preacher has with the audience. Well, we're going to start to see what those might be. Would someone start reading in chapter 2, verse 1?
Therefore, we must pay greater attention to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away from it. For if the message declared through angels was valid, and every transgression or disobedience received a just penalty, how can we escape? If we neglect so great a salvation. It was declared at first through the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard him, while God added his testimony by signs and wonders and various miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit, distributed according to his will.
Okay, let's just pause for a second. Just in those first 4 verses of chapter 2, do you see any concern the author might have with the audience?
Maybe drifting away.
Okay. Right there in the first verse. Make sure you pay greater attention to what we have heard, right? Don't listen to everything. Don't give everything the same level of trust and authority in your life, right? Pay closer attention to the things we have heard so that we do not drift away from it. So there does seem to be some concern of maybe drifting away, turning away from the path. That is a theme you're going to see come up again and again. A concern, a fear, a worry that the audience is starting to drift, to slide. Okay. And then in verse 2 where it says, for if the message declared through angels was valid and every transgression or disobedience received a just penalty, how can we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? It was declared at first through the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard him, while God added his testimony by signs and wonders and various miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. So if you've got somebody saying, well, what do we really have here? This author is going to say, well, we have the stories that have been handed on to us, like on the night in which Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, and, I passed on what I received from you. There's these stories, there's these teachings of Jesus that have been passed on. There are the stories of the signs and wonders that sort of validate, as the author is saying, what Jesus is teaching. And so it's not saying that we have nothing to go on here. We have a lot to go on. Make that the core of everything. Now, is there worry that some of these presumably Jewish Christians are starting to kind of say, I don't know about that. Maybe I'm going to go back to prioritizing certain parts of Torah more than some of these gospel teachings we're hearing. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's somebody that's like, this kind of Jesus flavor of the faith was kind of good for a time, but, there's another flavor over here. I think, this was cool, but now I'm going to go over here. Maybe that's a worry. But, yeah, David. Yeah.
Do you think that some of them said, oh, wait a minute, you said, early on, the reason that Jesus is higher than angels, that example is, did God ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? And in Genesis 6, it talks about the sons of God.
Yeah.
The Nephilim.
The Nephilim, yeah.
The women of earth, created the giants and the heroes of old.
Mm-hmm.
So, wouldn't you think some of them would have said, well, yeah, he said in Genesis 6 that they were the sons of God.
Mm-hmm.
So why is Jesus suddenly, the higher order?
Yeah. Well, and then like some of the kings, some of the prophets, given that designation as a child or a son of God. And this is sort of being given a yeah, a more like a begotten kind of son. Like that kind of is that's the, you're not just sort of like my child with like a special mission that I'm granting you, like, but a begotten child is like, there's a part of me that is, you're an iteration of me kind of a thing, as like a different kind of a thing. But you're right, that language is, we find elsewhere, right? But this author is certainly trying to establish, no, as a whole different kind of sonship, right? Completely different. So we have here at least a warning about, neglecting what they've heard, sort of the gospel, the stories, the teachings. And one of the things here that is pointed to is something that Paul points to, and that is the work of the Spirit in your midst now. These gifts that the Spirit is giving you now. There at the end, where it says, and the gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. So even in this, author really sees that part of the legitimacy of the church and the legitimacy of the gospel itself is watching how the Spirit is at work in the community now. So again, you don't have a New Testament that's printed, or written by a scribe. You've got these stories, you've got letters circulating, right? You've got preachers, you've got people that are worshiping together, but you've got the Spirit giving gifts to the community. And you see it in Paul, but you see it here, like, trust that. Like, that is key. So I just think it's really helpful to really think about church now, to see it, like, through the eyes of maybe like the author of Hebrews or Paul, that really sees that the church that is able to see in one another, like ground zero for the Holy Spirit at work in them, pulling out passions, pulling out gifts for the sake of the church and for the world. Like that is huge. And it's a part of, like, I think maybe central to how the early church understood their way of being church together. And so when you see little things like on the backs of the pledge cards, you remember, like, the check off a ministry you're interested in. That's one sort of baby step in trying to, like, get people to discern how might I like to serve in the coming year. What passion does this ministry area speak to me as? But it comes up more explicitly in certain conversations. But yeah, I think it's just, if you're trying to, like, what's a practical sort of like application of something I'm studying here, it's to just sort of ask the question, what sort of gifts do I think the Spirit has been nurturing me in my life, and that I may have to offer even in this season of life? I think that's it. One really good example is that Hank Everman. Hank is, he's a faithful member of our choir, retired history professor at EKU. But Hank, I always say, like, and I know many people say this, but if you want to know what's going on with somebody, call Hank, because he knows. And that's just because, like, he works the phone and email and cars like nobody's business. I mean, he does it all the time, and writes the most encouraging notes and gives the most beautiful phone calls to folks that keep tabs on folks that he thinks might be falling off the periphery. And so I've written to him and just tried to identify, like, that gift of encouragement and care and being the glue of a community is just a powerful working of the Spirit that I see in you and that I'm grateful for. So I think being able to name that for each other is actually really, really helpful. And it helps people sort of see in themselves not just like something I try to do to be a decent person, but maybe something that actually makes an impact that they can begin to see as, like, maybe this is how the Spirit is working through me. So, okay. John, do you mind to keep going in verse 5?
Now God did not subject the coming worlds about which we are speaking to angels, but someone has testified somewhere. What are human beings that you are mindful of them, or mortals that you care for them? You have made them for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned them with glory and honor, subjecting all things under their feet. Now in subjecting all things to them, God left nothing outside their control. As it is, we do not yet see everything in subjection subjection to them, but we do see Jesus, who for a little while was made lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. It was fitting that God, for whom and through whom all things exist, in bringing many children to glory, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For the one who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one Father. For this reason, Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters, saying, I will proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters. In the midst of the congregation I will praise you. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, here am I and the children whom God has given me.
All right, I'm just going to pause there and just say, like, there's a lot of echoes. We'll probably come back and revisit next week, but I just want to point out just a couple of things, just some main strands to notice here. One, talking about human beings. This is kind of, you hear echoes of some Genesis language about human beings sort of bearing the image of God and all things being subjected to have kind of like dominion over all that God has made. So that kind of vocational charge, which again, just as a reminder, because I feel like I must give this reminder at every possible turn, dominion does not mean this like consumer capitalist version of like you get to extract out of creation everything you want to, no matter what the cost. It's all there it's your piggy bank to empty out. Having dominion over is like having mastery over, like care over, like you would nurture a garden. It's something that you care for and see as precious like God does and delights in it and sees that it's good. You uphold and sustain the beauty of it. So that reality, that like unbelievable vocation that human beings are given, like the author saying that human beings are made just a little bit lower than the angels, but all of creation they're given dominion over it, that Christ is brought to our level, which is a pretty amazing level in the whole sort of pecking order of creation, but still sort of like maybe a demotion for Christ, and even tasted death, had suffering, but for this purpose of sanctifying everybody, so on and so forth. So it's kind of giving you this kind of, this sort of rank order, you might say, of like you've got human beings and you've got angels, but you've got Jesus. But it just continually makes Jesus sort of like the one that is just the ultimate in all of this. But continually like referencing the fact that Jesus sort of made this sort of like downward move to occupy a certain space for the purpose of purification, sanctification, all these things that are mentioned that'll be described more and more. And that makes us, this author says, as brothers and sisters with Jesus. So pretty incredible. So this is something that is this sort of like being sanctified or made pure or made holy. That work of Christ is meant to sort of like elevate what we see the truth of the gospel in us, right? We have become siblings to this one that's being described as so elevated. All right, let me just finish out, or would somebody just finish out chapter 2, starting through, let's see, verse 14 through 18?
Since therefore the children share flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared the same things, so that through death he might destroy the one who is the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of him. For it is clear that he did not come to help angels, but the descendants of Abraham. Therefore, he had to become like his brothers and sisters in every respect, so that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make a sacrifice of atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself was tested by what he suffered, he is able to help those who are being tested.
Okay. All right. Do you see like there's just like, I mean, he just drops like these references to Hebrew scriptures like a dime a dozen, just like every second. He's referencing Abraham. He's referencing the high priest. He's referencing atonement sacrifices. Like, I mean, he's so fluent in these concepts and language of the Hebrew scriptures. But the key point here is what? The gospel is not like, oh no, the angels have this really bad predicament and Jesus needs to sort of like take on the form of an angel to sort of rescue and bring salvation to the predicament of the angels. the author saying that Jesus became one of us, lower than the angels, still amazing in God's created order here, but Jesus became one of us because of, and he identifies this devil as wielding the power of death, and we're in slavery because of the fear of death. Like that's sort of like the weapon of mass destruction this evil figure has, right? It is death. Death is the ultimate power that has enslaved all of creation. And all of us are enslaved and are in fear of that enemy with this power. And so Jesus, part of the reason has come as sort to go toe-to-toe with this enemy that wields the power of death to deal with that predicament. What is salvation in this sense? It is to be rescued or liberated from this enemy that wields death, so that we're no longer slaves to death or have to fear death, but that we are ones who are children of light and siblings with Christ. So the thing that is referenced is like, well, how does that rescue happen, right? How does Jesus go face to face with this devil character that's mentioned who has death? Well, the way that this confrontation happens, it pulls from this language of the Hebrew Scriptures, this atonement language. And if I'll never forget the first time I saw a professor go up on a chalkboard, which I have to describe to my children what a chalkboard is. It's like everything's a Chromebook, which, don't get me started on Chromebooks. I have an irrational hatred of Chromebooks and how many hours they spend on it. And that could be out of complete ignorance. I'm not in education, so John, forgive me. Oh, you do too? Oh, good. Good. My hatred of it is affirmed. Good. All right. Well, anyways, describe to them like a chalkboard. But I remember the first time I saw a professor put the word atonement on there, and I immediately registered as like, oh, yeah, that's one of those theology words. You know, here comes a definition that'll show up on a test. But then just sort of like erased it and then broke it up into at one, A-T-O-N-E, and then M-E-N-T, meant, at one meant. So the atonement is essentially acknowledging that there is some kind of severed relationship with God, and that atonement is trying to restore a union with God. It is that Christ's mission is trying to bring us into a state of at-one-ment with God. That is atonement. And this category of atonement, or the you might say the process of generating at-one-ment with God in the Hebrew Scriptures, especially in Torah, is sacrifice, right? And so the author here is talking about Jesus as the one who comes as the high priest, who's not just going to enter the tabernacle on the one day of atonement a year to provide a sacrifice for the sins of all the people so that the children of Abraham can have another year of at-one-ment with God, but that Jesus is the high priest and, priming the pump for us, that he's the sacrifice, the high priest and the sacrifice, so that all children of Abraham, so all people, can have this at-one-ment with God. But not in something that's got to be re-upped every year, but that is, boom, total, right? It is the high priest that doesn't get any higher than Jesus, who also becomes the sacrifice for this at-one-ment with God that is good for all time, right? That is how Jesus faces the enemy with the weapon of death, and that is how the weapon of death is stripped from the enemy, right? So in the imagination of the author who's using all of these concepts of the Hebrew Scriptures. So any comments or questions before I think that's probably a good place to stop. And then we'll pick up in chapter 3 after that, where he starts talking about Moses, which, spoiler alert, Jesus greater than Moses. Yeah. But any comments, questions before we break?
Carrie, it seems like there's this fixation on angels.
Yeah.
Like, what's that mean? It just seems like it's such a weird thing to put the atonement against angels. It's like, does this audience have this conception of angels as? I don't know. Like, I don't have any reference point for that. But I'm just
such a good question. Like, yeah, because like Paul doesn't go around talking about angels this much, really. Like, not right out of the gate. So, like, what's the deal with the angels over and over? And I don't know, other than, maybe this audience has the reality of angels or the way that angels factor in their theology of that time or of that region. Maybe it's developed into something. Maybe there's a theory in their church or in that region of church that is sort of thinking of Jesus more as angelic being than sort of the imprint of God. So don't know. We can guess, but my guess is it's probably a mixture of like this angel theology is fairly prominent here in ways that maybe not elsewhere in the audiences that we see the text written to, and maybe also that's feeding a kind of thought that maybe Jesus is like the Prince of Angels or something. I don't know. It's complete speculation, but it's a great question. What's the deal with all the angel talk? Yeah. Okay, any other thoughts, questions? All right, thank you all very much. We'll pick up in chapter 3 next week.